Hi, I'm Hank Farrior from the Bible Broadcasting Network. One of the great experiences of my life took place when I traveled down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. The trip was organized by Answers in Genesis and Canyon Ministries. The purpose of the trip was to present the account of a biblical creation from a scientific perspective. Answers in Genesis is a ministry that provides education about creation, evolution, science, and the age of the earth. Canyon Ministries provides tours of the Grand Canyon, both along the rim and in the canyon. Those tours are presented from a biblical perspective. I would like to share with you what I learned about the creation of the Grand Canyon. The pictures you will see were provided by Canyon Ministries, and the information that I will convey was presented to me by representatives of Answers in Genesis and Canyon Ministries. So how did the Grand Canyon come to be? Did God just make it that way? If you had asked me that question before I went on this trip, I may have replied, yes, I think God just made it that way. But as you look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, you see that erosion has obviously occurred. So the questions are, when did that erosion occur and how did it happen? The Grand Canyon is amazing. It's 277 miles long, up to a mile deep, and up to 18 miles wide. There are mountains within the walls of the Grand Canyon that are higher than any mountain east of the Mississippi River. As we ponder the creation of the Grand Canyon, what we need to do is look at the evidence through the lens of the Bible. The Grand Canyon gives us insight into the creation of the earth and of a great worldwide flood. Secular scientists and creation scientists have different views about creation, but Scripture says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." There's a dam upstream of the Grand Canyon called Glen Canyon Dam, which created Lake Powell. Downstream of the Grand Canyon is Hoover Dam, which created Lake Mead. Lake Mead is the largest man-made lake in the country. And the Colorado has some of the best rapids in the world. The water is extremely cold. The Colorado is just an average-sized river. The reason there are rapids is because the river is shallow and rocks on the bottom cause the water to become turbulent. The rapids are a result of rocks flowing into the river from side canyons. The flow of the Colorado is not sufficient enough to clear out the rocks, so rapids develop. Do you see a problem with that fact and the common theory of how the Grand Canyon was formed? The Grand Canyon is becoming less grand. It's filling up with rocks. Just a side note, one of the things that fascinated me about the Grand Canyon was the variety of wildlife. And we know that God created these things according to their kind. Oh, there may have been some adapting within species over generations, but not from one species to another. Just look at the variety of plant and wildlife within the Grand Canyon. Most secular scientists believe in an old Earth, one in which the Colorado River over millions of years carved out the Grand Canyon. Some creation scientists also believe in an old Earth, but many believe in a young Earth. They believe the Earth was created in 6 days, according to the Bible. Now, just because you believe in a young Earth, one that is 6,000 or 7,000 years old, that does not mean you necessarily believe God created the Grand Canyon just as you see it here. Erosion is very real, and it's obvious erosion happened here. When we visit the Grand Canyon or read geology textbooks, we will find evolutionary theories. Supposedly, the rock layers we see in the Grand Canyon were laid down a particle at a time over hundreds of millions of years. Then the Grand Canyon was later carved slowly by the Colorado River, also over millions of years. Creation scientists think otherwise. So how did the Grand Canyon get eroded the way it did? The answer is that there was a great worldwide flood. Again, the rate of flow of the Colorado River is not sufficient to carve that canyon. It is true that there is a dam at the upper end of the Colorado that regulates water flow, but even before the dam was constructed, the river flow was not sufficient to erode the bed of the river. The Grand Canyon is literally filling up. Science can be divided into two categories: operation science and origin science. Operation science is typified by fields such as biology, chemistry, and physics. Operation science involves being able to observe and repeat scientific experiments, and then being able to predict what will happen. We study medicine and come up with vaccines. We study physics and design rockets. With origin science, we study things as they are, and then attempt to determine how they got there. As we study the creation of the Grand Canyon, we are using origin science. There are three important truths in the Bible related to creation. First, in Genesis, a day is a day, which means a literal 24-hour period of time. Genesis 1:5 says, "And there was evening, and there was morning, one day." A literal interpretation of this passage means a 24-hour day. And in Exodus 20:11, God gives the reason for keeping the Sabbath. He said, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day." If a day in Genesis is not a 24-hour day, then there is no reason for keeping a weekly Sabbath. Secondly, there was no death before sin. The first death came as a result of sin that took place in the Garden of Eden. Romans 5:12 says, "Just as sin entered the world through one man, Adam, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men." And third, Noah's flood was an actual global event. Genesis 7:19 and 20 read, "The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits, that's about 20 feet, higher, and the mountains were covered." Jesus talked about the flood. In Matthew, Jesus said, "For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Creation scientists believe that during the flood, all the rock and soil of the earth were washed away down to a very basic layer of rock. Then, as the waters receded, the rock and sand suspended in the floodwaters settled in layers. If the earth were completely covered with water, then deposits settled, what would you expect to see in the deposits? You would expect to see evidence of sea creatures, even in high elevations, deposited in those locations as the waters receded. Not just plant life, but animal life. And that's exactly what we see in higher elevations of the Grand Canyon, the Himalayas, and other places around the earth. Evidence of sea creatures. Evidence of a worldwide flood. Further, whatever fossilized these fish happened very quickly. One fish was caught in the act of eating another, and the fish were intact when they were fossilized. Evolutionary scientists say rock layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down over millions of years. If that were the case, you would not see fossils of creatures like fish that are intact. What happens to a fish after it dies? It starts to deteriorate. It starts to rot. These fish were not trapped in amber like a bee or a mosquito. They were trapped in sandstone. There must have been a sudden dramatic event which fossilized these fish. That event was the sudden receding of the waters of Noah's flood. Literally miles of sediment were suddenly compacted onto the surface of the earth. More evidence of a worldwide flood is this Coconino sandstone. You see it on the right, and then you can follow it all the way around the rim of the canyon. Sandstone comes from sand, and when we think of sand, we think of the ocean. The Coconino sandstone is spread out in a swath covering portions of 7 states. Note the reddish color on the map. Perhaps that sandstone was washed out of the Grand Canyon during the Great Flood as the waters receded. The Tepete sandstone is another layer. It covers the majority of North America and extends across Europe and much of Africa. All of this sandstone points to a worldwide flood. This rock is strong evidence of these layers being flood deposits. Can't you just imagine floodwaters pushing this material before it solidified? You can see that the rock is bent, or as the geologists would say, it's folded. Notice that this folding has taken place without cracking the rock, and for scale, notice the man in the fold. That fold is over 300 feet high. Here's another fold. Note the 90-degree fold in the rock. And again, note the person in the fold. One issue that needs to be addressed is the dating methods that are used to determine the age of rock formations. Those dating methods are highly suspect. Based upon dating methods, the top layer shown here is supposed to be over 100 million years younger than the bottom layer. But one layer is right on top of the other. If there is a huge age difference between the rock layers, why is there nothing between the layers? We know the Bible says, "The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them." Psalms 104, verse 8. And again, when evolutionists look at this contact point between sandstone and shale, they imagine 5 million years of missing time and material, because dating methods indicate the ages are so different. But the creationists see the result of a flood, only on a scale so large that it boggles the mind of the evolutionist. Note that sharp line between the two layers, and this contact is virtually the same throughout the length of the canyon and the rest of the 200,000 square miles it covers. Now, if the millions of years were true, what would you expect to see between the layers? You would expect to see something like this, the layers showing signs of physical or chemical erosion between them. But you don't. What you do see are tabletop flat contacts throughout the length of the canyon, which is consistent with these layers being flood deposits. Note the erosion on the top layer, and then note how the lower layer is perfectly flat. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, some 200 million cubic yards of material was deposited by volcanic mud flows into the river channels at the base of Mount St. Helens. And look at the similarity between the Grand Canyon Formation and the Mount St. Helens Formation. It certainly did not take millions of years for the Mount St. Helens Formation to be created. The Grand Canyon is at the center of the evolutionary debate because the only way secular scientists can explain the creation of the Grand Canyon is to invoke millions of years of erosion. If they have to admit there was a special creation of the earth and maybe a worldwide flood, they have to admit there is a God to whom they are accountable. One reason the idea of the Colorado carving out the Grand Canyon is not valid is that there are portions of the rim of the canyon that are much higher than others. So the river would have had to have flowed uphill to carve the canyon. A river would not do that. However, a huge catastrophic flow of water could have done that. Perhaps when the waters of the Great Flood receded, they simply channeled out the Grand Canyon. But here's another theory. As the floodwaters receded, huge lakes were created in basins over the earth. There may have also been tremendous amounts of rain after the flood because the environment was so moist. Eventually, the waters of a huge lake broke through a natural dam, followed the path of least resistance, creating catastrophic erosion. What we know as the Grand Canyon was the result. Then rainwater and water from springs and streams follow the Grand Canyon. That runoff is what we now call the Colorado River. The Colorado River did not create the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon created the Colorado River. This is some of the basement rock of the Grand Canyon. Most creation scientists think this is part of God's original creation. During the flood, all rock layers above this one were washed away. As waters receded, material settled in layers on top of this layer. Radioisotope dating is used to make claims for the age of the Grand Canyon. Radioisotope dating is based on the radioactive decay of a parent element to its daughter element. There are several very basic assumptions made in radioisotope dating. The three main ones are: first, that the rock starts out with a known amount of both parent and daughter elements. But what if there were more daughter element in the rock to begin with than assumed? A second assumption is that nuclear decay rates never change. But what if something like a global flood altered the decay rate? And third, supposedly all this takes place in a closed system which does not allow for any contamination. But again, what if elements can leach in or out of the rock? If any of these assumptions is in error, the end result would be incorrect. Creation scientists have sent samples in for dating and received wildly different ages. The dating method is simply unreliable. Remember, we are using origin science, not operational science. No scientist was alive when the Grand Canyon was created. Secular scientists can only theorize. But we have God's perfect word, the Bible. But examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Evolutionists and creationists look at the same data as they travel the Grand Canyon, only they look at the data from different worldviews. The earth is either millions of years old or thousands of years old. It cannot be both. And the answer to the question, how old is the earth, has deep biblical implications. To us, the answer is obvious. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Romans 1:20. If we do not believe the biblical account of creation, at what point in the text of the Bible do we start believing it? Do we believe the Ten Commandments came from God? Do we believe the parting of the Red Sea was divinely caused? Do we believe in the virgin birth? Do we start believing the Bible at John 3:16? If so, why not Genesis 1:1? Do we realize that God promises a Messiah in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15? And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There are over 100 references to Genesis chapters 1 through 11 in the New Testament. If you call into question the historicity of Genesis 1 and 2, you call into question the historicity of all of the Bible. We've been talking mostly about geology, not biology, but the two sciences are intertwined in the creation debate. Charles Darwin thought that the fossil record in rocks would show a slow progression of the evolution of life. In The Origin of Species, published in 1859, Charles Darwin said, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory," meaning his theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Darwin believed that as more of the fossil record was revealed, his theory would be shown to be correct. But now, with hundreds of thousands of fossils collected, there is still no evidence to support his theory. it is still an obvious and serious objection. So, regarding the creation of the Grand Canyon, we can say, as Paul wrote to the Colossians, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. The Grand Canyon is God's fingerprint on the earth. Thank you for watching.